Good morning, Miss Neville Science students. Here's our first lesson in our 5 lessons that we'll be learning about heat. We're going to be starting to talk about heat today in its movement. How does heat travel from one place to another? And so the 2 questions that this lesson is going to help us to answer is how does heat move or travel from one place to another? And how does heat cause particles to behave? Your objective for today is to be able to illustrate, to show Miss Neville in your own drawings and writings how heat travels and affects particle behavior. So let's get started. Our first question that we need to write down in our notes, we'll also need to draw this picture, use the same colors Miss Neville uses. And so feel free to pause this lesson as you get that done. We need to be able to answer the question, how does heat travel? So when we're talking about how heat travels, it's important for us to know that heat will always move from a warm place to a cooler place. So let's look at this picture of this house that we have here. When we see this house here, inside this house, it's 77 degrees. That's a pretty warm house. But outside the house, it's 65 degrees. The question Ms. Neville has for you is, please write this question down. How do you predict the heat will move if the door of the house is open? Well, if you said that heat will move from the inside of that house to the outside of the house, you're correct. And why is that? It's because heat will always move, heat will always travel from a warmer place to a cooler place. So, our next question we're going to work to answer today is how does heat cause atoms or particles to behave? The first thing we need to understand, though, is what in the world is an atom or a particle? Everything around you, even the air you breathe, the water you drink, your fingernails, rocks, grass, all of those things are made up of atoms. Yes, atoms are the basic building blocks of all living and non-living things. Atoms are the basic building blocks of all living and non-living things. Please write down that question, those 2 questions there that you see actually, and you might want to play that the answer to that question back so that you can write it down in your notes specifically. So when we're talking about how does heat cause atoms or particles to behave, let's look at the example of water. If I were to put my fists up, just like this, if I were to put my fists up, and my fists are representing atoms, when those atoms are inside of an object, they're constantly vibrating. Yes, they're constantly moving. Heat is going to cause those atoms to do 2 things. As we can see in our picture here, heat causes particles to spread apart. Okay, so we see here with ice, those particles are much closer together. They're chilled, in that chilled water, those particles are much closer together. Then as that water sits out, it's going to get warmer and it becomes room temperature water. It causes those particles to spread apart, just like we see in this picture here. And then when we add more heat to that water, get it to boiling, we're going to see that those particles spread even more apart. Even that steam, that gas that liquid water is transformed into, those particles are much more spread apart. So it's important for us to know that the first way that atoms will behave when they're exposed to heat is that those particles will begin to spread apart. Another thing that will happen, it causes those particles to also move faster. Yes, as those particles spread apart, they also start to move faster. So to illustrate this with our fists, chilled water, room temperature water, what do you notice? Those particles are spreading apart and moving faster. And then as that water starts to boil, those particles are spreading out even more. Yes, they're moving even faster. So our closure questions today that you'll be answering in Schoology are, how does heat affect particle behavior? And how does heat move or travel? Please make sure you write down and draw every picture you saw in this slideshow today in your science notebook. We'll show this exact same PowerPoint again in class, but Ms. Neville may not be able to stay on those pictures in class long enough for you to draw them all to your satisfaction. So please make sure that you take advantage of this time now and get those pictures drawn in your science notebook.